Alright guys, how's it going today? Hope everyone's having a good day so far. Today I got a 2005 Peterbilt in the shop here. We're going to be fixing a front cover leak. So, right in between the engine block and the cover there's a gasket there. It's leaking oil. It's kind of common on these engines. This is the older twin cam engine. It's not a single cam. We're going to get everything stripped off the front of the engine there. Everything that's attached to the cover is going to have to come off. We're going to try to do this with the radiator still installed. Save some time and some labor there. Get it all peeled off, get it cleaned up, put a new gasket in, put it all back together, show you how to set up the gears, the timing, all that kind of good stuff. So stick around, let's get to it. Alright, first thing we're going to do is get the oil drained out of the engine. We're going to have to pull off the oil pan and the suction tube as well to get the oil pan out of the truck on this particular truck. While underneath, we're going to go ahead and drain some antifreeze off as well. We're only going to drain off about a 5-gallon pail's worth because we're going to leave the radiator in, just pull off the top RAD pipe, and that'll give us enough to get that top pipe off. I'm going to get started by pulling off the AC condenser. We're going to take the AC compressor and condenser off this truck without disconnecting any lines, so we don't have to drain any Freon, and we don't have to worry about refilling Freon or contaminating the system or vacuuming or any of that good stuff. And I'll just lay it up out of the way for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and get the top RAD pipe pulled off, just the clamp here at the radiator, and then also the one at the top of the thermostat housing. Get it off and out of our way. And then we're going to have to pull off the intercooler pipes. So we'll take the one off right at the intercooler here, and also the V-band at the intake manifold. And once we get that thing off and out of the way, we will move over to the other side and get that one off as well. And with those intercooler pipes off, then we'll go to the RAD support mounts on the top here. We'll take those two nuts off, one on each side, and that's going to allow us to now let the RAD tilt forward. Next thing I'm going to do is get the intake piping off from the turbo here that goes up to the air cleaners, or to the firewall you could say. Well, let's get all those pipes off, get them laid on the back of the truck and out of the way, because we're going to have to pull the valve cover to get at the cam so we can put the timing wedges in them. Alright, now here you can see the RAD's tilted forward. We did loosen off the bottom nuts on the RAD to give it a little bit more movement so it can move forward. With it like that, you can easily get to the fan. We'll get it out of here and out of the way. And then I'm going to move up top, get the valve cover off, and get it opened up so we can get in there and get our wedges into the camshafts. The two wedges go into the camshaft, and there's a pin down on the crank. I'll show you that in a little bit. That keeps everything in place and timed, so you can strip all the gears off the front of the motor, and it holds everything where it should be. Then you can put it all back on, and there's a bit of procedure for that, but we'll touch on that later. Alright, so the next thing we moved on to is getting the accessories off of the right side of the engine here. Air conditioning pump has already been pulled off, and now it's all looped together to the other side of the truck and out of our way completely with the condenser. Alternator's off now and just set on top of the manifold over there, and then it leaves me that accessory bracket assembly to pull off and get it out of the way. And then you can see the next thing we did was pull off the balancer and the front pulley there. You just use a couple of pry bars and get it wiggled off and get it out of there. Sometimes it can be kind of tough, but it will come. Then I moved on to getting the fan hub off of the engine. It's pretty heavy, so sometimes you might want a hand with it, but if you get yourself underneath it, you can usually lift it off pretty good. The water pump is actually going to stay on the engine, and so is the air compressor itself, like for the air system on the truck. You just take out the 4 mounting bolts, we leave everything else connected. There's a bracket on the back side of the air compressor, so we'll leave it in place and we won't touch it. Next thing I'm going to do here is pull off the front engine main seal for the crankshaft. There's just small 10mm nuts all the way around it. You take all those out, and then the new seal will come with 3 Allen headed bolts that you'll screw into it, and that'll actually kind of pull the seal back. Usually it doesn't pull it enough, but once you get a gap there, you can take some pry bars in there, work at it with some pry bars, and get it to pop off the front of the crankshaft there. Just be gentle not to touch or damage or scratch that front mating surface on the crankshaft. Again, with a bit of prying back and forth, the seal finally popped off, and this one was a bit of a bugger, but it came. Then we're going to move on to pulling the front covers off. Start with the top cover here. It's got 13mm head bolts. Take all those out, it'll pop right off. And same thing with the bottom one. 13mm head bolts, get them all out of there, and it'll pop right off nice and easy. Next thing we did was get the oil pan slid out of there. This one we had to pull the suction tube in order to get it out of there. It's a bit of a tight fit. And then we got the pin put into the crankshaft, and the 2 wedges put into the camshafts. I am going to put a link to another video I made and an in-depth timing procedure on the pin and wedges. Next thing I did was have to pull off the front gears. Now we have this homemade tool that I made. It's just out of 1/2 inch steel. It's a circle I cut out with a plasma cutter, and then a little spacer on the bottom, which is also 1/2 inch steel. And then you just drill the 3 holes here to match up with the 3 holes in the valve cam gear, and then also the 2 for the injector cam gear. It's just like the one you can buy, and it works really good. So we'll go ahead and get those 2 gears popped off. You just take out the center bolts. You can just use a normal ratchet for that. And then you can put the puller on, and as you tighten the bolts, that center nub that stuck out on the puller pushes on the cam snout and pulls the gear off, and it'll pop that gear off like nothing. It works really good, and it only took like 20 minutes to make that tool, so it's probably one of the best things I ever made for working on these engines. But like I said before, you also can just go ahead and buy a tool, and they all work great. Alright, with the valve cam gear off, we can move on to the injector cam. This one's usually very tight, so here we're using the 3/4 inch torque wrench to get the nut broke, or the bolt broke loose. And once you get it broke loose, then it's kind of the same as the valve one. To put the little puller on and use 2 bolts to just kind of tighten them up. Just go back and forth between the 2 bolts, and eventually get a little pop, and the gear will be off. You can get it off, put it on your bench, clean it up, and then we can move on to the 2 idler gears that are lower down below those 2 top cam gears. These 2 idler gears are pretty tight too, so you can run a big breaker bar to get them broke loose. And then you can just zip them out with an impact or a drill or whatever. You have to remove both of them, but the bottom gear on the crank and the tone ring will both stay on there. The cover is open in the back to clear that when you want to remove it. But you do have to get these 2 idler gears off. So just get the bolts loosened up, zip the bolts out. The bottom one here, you're going to have to actually take out the bolts in the washer first, and then you'll be able to kind of tilt the gear forward and slip it out around the tone ring. It's a pretty tight fit, but it does come out if you get just that kind of right angle there, as you can see. Alright, next step is going to be removing the front engine mount. So you're going to get a block underneath the engine. We used to use a big block like this with a bottle jack. Make sure you're pushing on the sides of the engine block where the oil pan mounts and not the block stiffener plate. And with that taking the weight off the front of the motor, we can go ahead and zip. There's 6 bolts that hold the engine mount to the front of the block, and then there's also the 2 bolts in the center there that hold it to the frame mount on the truck. Those are the rubber isolator mounts. So we get those 6 bolts out, and then we'll get these center 2 bolts out, and then it's going to be loose, and we'll just go ahead and lift it out of there, and then we're going to be ready to pull that cover off. There's quite a few bolts holding the cover in. You're going to watch for some tricky ones that are down by that tone ring there, in between the on the inside of the cover, but in between it and the crank. There's a few outside ones near the top where the fan hub was, and then don't forget your ones that connect the top of the cover to the cylinder head. There's quite a few bolts, so just go over it twice, make sure you don't forget anything. When it's time to pull the cover off, it should come off very easy. You should not have to pry on it. Do not pry on it. You could end up breaking a flange or cracking the cover, and then you're going to be back just square one here, not fixing any oil leaks. So get the cover out of the way there. We'll get it laid on the bench, and then we'll start cleaning everything up. Okay, there you can see the engine block. You can see your 2 cam snouts sticking out there. That's what it looks like without the cover. Of course, we're going to have to go and wash all that up, clean it up real nice. But we'll take a look at the cover here, and you can see down in the bottom corner is where the gaskets actually tore. And this is where it was leaking. And it's pretty funny to see here, actually. It's been packed right full of silicone as they tried to repair the leak from the outside. So we'll get that cleaned up. We'll get this cleaned up. All new gaskets, seals everywhere. One thing also we should note is we didn't pull the compressor off. We just left it in place. The back bracket will hold it just fine. And just take the 4 bolts out, the mounting bolts, and then make sure you get a new gasket for that as well. But it can stay right there. You don't need to take it out. That's just extra work. Okay, we're gonna get everything cleaned up, and we'll start putting her back together. Alright, so make sure you take your time and clean everything up really good. That's pretty critical. I mean, all this work and you get some debris in there or something, keep the gasket from sealing properly. really gonna suck. So I like to go over everything with a little bit of a wire brush here first, and then I'll go over with a die grinder with one of those little finger discs on it, those plastic ones. They don't damage aluminum or the surface, metal surface. So go ahead and get her cleaned up, and then I'll make sure you vacuum it out, and then you'll use a lot of brake clean or some solvent, get it all washed down real nice until you get it nice and shiny and nice and clean. With our covers nice and cleaned up and the front of the block nice and cleaned up, we got the gasket put on here. We did put a small layer of RTV on each side of the gasket in the problematic areas, which is down at the bottom here, basically from the bottom idler gear down. So just ensure that little bit of extra added peace of mind, you know, that it's not going to leak again. Then you just want to be careful, get the cover lined up. It's really helpful to have two people for this. The thing's kind of heavy and it's a bit awkward there with the RAD still in place. Get it all lined up, get it onto the dowels there, and just make sure it's fully seated before you start tightening any bolts. That's a pretty thin cover in some parts, and if you start cranking on bolts before it's seated all the way, or say before you have it lined up on the air compressor or something like that, you're going to end up cracking something or breaking something. So just take your time, and once you get it lined up there, get all the bolts in, and then you want to go ahead and torque them. Torque spec on these, I believe, was 47 foot-pounds and then 30 degrees. So pretty critical you get these nice and tight and follow the spec, and make sure you replace all the little sealing washers on each of the bolts as well. They all have their own little sealing washer on the ones that are inside in the oil. And now this is me just coming back and doing the 30 degrees pass. When you're working on these engines, it really helps, it really pays off to invest in a good torque wrench, one that will do the degrees, because you can set it to torque and electronic, so it'll beep, and then you can also set it to 30 degrees, and you pull that 30 degrees, it'll beep, and it just saves a lot of time. The last thing you want to do is put in that special bolt here right in the center. It's torqued to 49 foot-pounds. It's a different bolt because it has to clear the gears where they go there. First thing you want to do is get the lower idler gear in place here. Some of these idler gears or cam gears are scissor type gears, and they have small bolts going sideways in them. You take a wrench and you back off two of those bolts in order to line the teeth up and take the preload out of the springs. Once you get this gear in place, go ahead and slide the 4 bolts and the washer on top of it. Now you want to get those all just kind of snugged up, but you do not want to have them perfectly tight quite yet. Then you're going to want to go ahead and install the second idler gear just on top of the first idler gear. Now when you're installing these idler gears, pay attention to the way they're positioned. They are marked on the center part there, the hub, and the washer, which way is up, and that's important. Make sure they're installed correctly. The bottom one goes on a dowel, make sure it's installed on the dowel. And the top one again needs to be just installed so the bolts are just finger tight so it still can slide back and forth like this. Make sure your tapered gears and camshaft snubs are very clean, and then you're going to install some Loctite 609 on the tapered snubs there of the camshafts. Go ahead and slide the gear on, and then put the bolt and the washer in, and again just leave it loose, just hand tight so you can still move the gear freely on the camshaft. We're going to need to install feeler gauges to set backlash, which I'll do a close-up on here in just a second, but put Loctite 609 on your valve camshaft now and get its gear installed, and same as the other one, put the bolt and the washer on, but just leave it a little loose so the cam stays still and the gear can still move freely. Now remember, our cams are both wedged right now, they cannot move. Alright, we'll zoom in for a little bit of a close-up of where I have the 2 feeler gauges installed. They are both 8th thou feeler gauges. I had them installed on the back side of the driving gear teeth, just right there as you can see, and just right there. Now that's going to set the backlash in the gears. You're going to take that secondary idler and you're going to pull it towards the other side of the engine to take all the play out, so it's just whatever's in the feeler gauges. Then we're going to torque that idler to 52 foot-pounds, same with the bottom one, and then we come back and we pull them 60 degrees, and that's going to hold the 2 idlers in place, and then we'll move on to torquing the camshaft gears. Here I'm just going back to pull the 60 degrees. These new digital torque wrenches are a lifesaver. You just enter in the degrees you need to pull. You give it a pull with your hand and it'll beep when you hit that certain degrees. Even if you run out of room, you can always ratchet back and it still keeps track of the degrees that you've pulled. If you're doing these engines all the time, you gotta have a set of digital torque wrenches. Update.
Or is that for future reference?
With those bottom two idlers tight, we can now move on to the camshaft gears. These tapered shaft gears, I like to tighten to the initial torque, then I like to back them off a quarter turn, and then I like to tighten again to that same torque. So the valve camshaft gear is 100 foot-pounds, so do it twice, and then you're going to pull that final 90 degrees after the 100 foot-pounds. But I'm just going to jump over to the valve camshaft gear here real quick. It's torqued to 109 foot-pounds. Again, I torque it to 109 foot-pounds, and then I'm going to back it off a quarter turn, and then I'm going to torque it to 109 foot-pounds again. That way you're going to ensure that it's fully seated and not going to come loose on you. With that one torqued and tight, now I'll move back over to the injector camshaft gear and do that final 90 degrees. Alright, with that final 90 degrees pulled, we can go ahead and pull the feeler gauges out of the gears and pull the wedges out of the cams and pull the pin out of the crank. Yeah. Before I close up the cover, I always like to do a revolution of the motor, make sure it spins over correctly. And with that all good, we can officially get on to the putting everything back together part of this project. So first you want to go ahead and get these gaskets pushed into the front cover here for the front covers. Where they do meet there, you want to put a little bit of silicone after you trim it off to the right length. Get the bottom cover installed, get all the bolts in. The torque spec for these bolts is all 28 foot-pounds, as well as the top cover. So you go ahead and get them all torqued up. Once the bottom's done, we'll do the top one, same thing. Get the gasket pushed in there, trim off the excess, and then take a little dab of silicone and put it up right at the top there where they join. And then you can go ahead and pop the cover on. Get all those bolts in. Don't forget the big perimeter steel spreader plate to make sure it seals good. Get them torqued up to 28 foot-pounds as well. Now keep in mind for the rest of the video, everything's kind of exact opposite of taking it apart. So I'm going to try speed a bunch of this up just to kind of get through it, but I will talk through it and mention any tips and tricks as you're installing it, and of course all the torque specs as usual. Alright, so for the front crank seal, you want to get it set into place here. Make sure you have the studs kind of lined up there. You need to get it kind of started straight, so you can use a hammer, just kind of tap it in. There's also that white spacer you're going to need to install on there. There is a special tool for this. I do not have the special tool, so I did install mine by hand. Alright, then we're going to zip that front engine cross member back on, or that front motor mount, whatever you want to call it. Those bolts torque to 72 foot-pounds and then 60 degrees, and then the two bottom isolator ones we just do with the impact. Then we'll get the engine balancer installed onto the crank snout here next. There is a dowel for it. It does only go on one way, so make sure you line that up. Then you can get the pulley on there, and don't forget your front little spacer plate that goes on. Then you go ahead and torque it. It is torqued to 127 foot-pounds. Start out with a crisscross pattern and then go around in a circle and then go one more time to make sure it's good. Then I can get the fan hub slipped on, and the fan hub I usually tighten to about 80 foot-pounds, just kind of for peace of mind. It would really suck if the fan hub came loose. Then we'll move back over to the other side of the engine here and get the accessory bracket installed. Then we can get the alternator mounted back into place, get the belt slipped on it, get the fan back in place while we're up here, get it tightened up. You might want to put a little bit of Loctite on the fan bolts. They are just 3/8 and you could torque them to about 38 foot-pounds if you wanted to. Then I'm going to get the AC compressor installed and back mounted up here. And don't forget to plug in the wires for it, and get your hoses routed. If you had it looped over, you might want to be careful as to not to kink the hoses. Make sure you have it twisted in the right way. To start the timing procedure, we're going to use the marks on the balancer. It's labeled A, B, and C. You want to go ahead and get a paint marker and highlight them so they're easier to see. This here is the chart we're going to be using, so you can say we start at A, and then you can do set cylinder on valve on 1. And these are the feeler gauges we're going to be using. You're going to need a 14 and a 27th thou feeler gauge. An inch-pounds torque wrench dial gauge like this is preferred. It needs to go to 71 inch-pounds. So start by rolling the engine over to position A, and then you want to check to make sure your valves are loose on 1. If they're not, roll it over to the next A, or else start on 6 on the chart. We'll start by checking where the valve lash is at. I'm going to guess it's going to be tight if it hasn't been done in a while. You're going to want to stick the feeler gauge between the valve bridge and the rocker. And if it's a little bit tight and you can't get the feeler gauge in there, just crack the jam nuts loose and back the adjusters out just a little bit until you can get your feeler gauge in there. 27 thou is for the exhaust rocker, which is the shorter rockers on the Cummins ISX, and the 14 thou is for the intake rocker, which is the longer rocker on the Cummins ISX. So you'll stick your feeler gauge in there, then you're going to use your Allen to kind of tighten it up just so you have a little bit of drag on the feeler gauge, and then tighten it up with your wrench. And do the same thing with the exhaust. And once you have them both set, then we'll move on to doing the injector. To do the injector, it's as simple as taking the inch-pounds torque wrench and tightening it to 71 inch-pounds. Make sure you back off the jam nut first. I like to go ahead and just give it a little half a turn loose, and then very slowly pull it until you see that 71 inch-pounds on the gauge. Once you have that done, you can go ahead and tighten the jam nut, and that's going to take care of it for cylinder number 1. We'll move on to the next position. Go ahead and roll the motor over to position B. Get it lined up there to the mark on the front cover. We'll take a look at our chart. The next one is B is 5. So we'll go ahead and go to cylinder number 5. Make sure you check, make sure both rockers are loose. Then you're going to do the same thing as we did to cylinder 1. Maybe go ahead and back off your 2 jam nuts. Loosen off the rocker adjusters a little bit. 14 thousandths for the longer intake rocker, and 27 thousandths for the shorter exhaust rocker. Now again, slight drag on the feeler gauge. Then you can go ahead and tighten the jam nut. Do that for both exhaust and intake. And then you can grab the inch-pounds torque wrench, back off the jam nut on the injector adjuster, tighten it to 71 inch-pounds, and then tighten the jam nut up, and we'll move on to the next one. So that's now position C. So we'll go back to our chart. Position C. Next one is 3. So again, go to cylinder 3. Always check to make sure your valves are loose. I mean, they pretty much have to be, but if they aren't, you might find a problem. It's always good to check to make sure they're loose. Make sure you're at top dead center on the cylinder you're adjusting on. Heck, if you're tired, you might go to the wrong cylinder. Who knows? So just make sure you check and make sure that both rockers are loose and you can wiggle them a little. Then, same as the last 2 cylinders we did. Back off your jam nuts. Get your feeler gauges in there. Get everything set up. Do the injector. Tighten everything up. I should also mention right now that I usually just snug everything up or tighten everything up by hand. After you do a bunch of them, you get a good feel for it. But the torque spec for the jam nuts is 33 foot-pounds. So if you got a torque wrench handy and you want to go ahead and torque them for peace of mind, go right ahead. And with that all wrapped up, we can get back to the front of the motor. We'll roll it back over to A again and take a look at our chart. We're on cylinder number 6 now. Everything is just repetitive at this point, so I think I'll just go ahead and start speeding the video up here and just giving a light voiceover on it. So just go ahead and set 6 just like you did the rest of them. Make sure they're loose, feeler gauges, light drag, and the inch-pounds torque wrench on there. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward this video until we get to the next cylinder. And then again, whirl it back over to B, get it lined up nice there. B, cylinder number 2, comes after 6, and repeat the same procedure, and then you can move on to position C and onto the last cylinder and wrap things up. And finally, the last position, C. Take a look at our chart one more time. It's going to put us on cylinder number 4. So, just like you've done 5 times already, you should be getting pretty good at it. Check if your valves are loose, get your feeler gauges in there, set your injector. Also good practice to go over, I guess, and check and make sure everything's tight. Make sure you haven't forgot to tighten any of the jam nuts. Just go over each and every one of them with your wrench. Make sure they're all snug, or your torque wrench if you're using a torque wrench. And then it wouldn't hurt actually to roll over back to position A and check number 1 again. Make sure your valve lash is correct. And if you wanted to, you could roll through all the rest of the cylinders and check the individual valve lash on each of them. Make sure you didn't accidentally set exhaust to one of the intakes, or one of the intakes to one of the exhausts. It's not much time now. That saves some headache in the future. Then we're going to go ahead and get the valve cover back on. We got a new gasket set in there. We'll get the bolts installed, get them all tightened up, and we're going to torque them all to about 28 foot-pounds. Make sure you do torque your valve cover. They can leak and they can run all the way down the back of the block and make a bit of a mess. So I always torque them to 28 foot-pounds. Never have any trouble. Never have to second guess it. Now, a couple of things to mention that happened off camera here was the intercooler pipes got put on, the top rad hose got put on, and the radiator got pushed back to where it needed to be, and those 2 support rods on the top got tightened up. And also the suction tube, which is torqued to 35 foot-pounds, and the oil pan, which is torqued to 41 foot-pounds, are also installed now. And then we can go ahead and put on our intake pipes and connect them both to the turbo, get all those clamps tightened up, and we're really starting to wrap this thing up. We're just going to need to spin on a new oil filter, fill the thing with oil, and we're going to be ready to crank this thing up. Just figured I better jump in here for a second and mention that ticking you're hearing is the exhaust leak at the back of the manifold. 2 of the bolts are broken, and we're just waiting on parts before we fix that. But we want to get everything else back together and get the engine up and running, and check for leaks and make sure we have this all solved before we went any further with it. Alright, so that's going to pretty much wrap it up for this video now. The truck's all back together, running good. No more silicone on the outside of the block sealing it up. It's going to be leak free and running good for a long time now. If there's anything I missed, or you got any questions or any comments, please leave them down below. Hit that like if you liked the video or if it helped you out in any way. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. It really helps me out. So thanks again for watching, and maybe we'll see you in the next video.